joining me on the phones right now. Hopefully he's not wearing a mask. He threatened to earlier in a email. Our good friend of the show, editor of Quorum Report, Scott Braddock. Scott, good morning. How are you doing?
Doing well. No mask inside my house. I don't think that's required.
No, as of right now, it's not.
Right now, we're fine.
I mean, in the future, though, you might be forced to. Who knows?
Yeah, the restrictions in Austin are now such that you have to have the mask if you're going to be out in public. And somebody was asking me about if they were jogging or walking a dog or anything like that. Look, technically they're saying that you need to be wearing a mask if you're out and about in Austin. But, Chad, let's get real. It's a matter of enforcement. If somebody's jogging down the street here in my neighborhood, I don't think anybody's going to give them a hard time if they're not wearing a mask. They're concerned about people who are going into grocery stores, going into places where people are gathering, and that sort of thing. I saw on CNN this morning a segment they were talking with Dr. Sanjay Gupta about whether or not you could get or give the virus off, if you were jogging by somebody really quickly. And he said, no, probably not. You're probably okay. And, for guys who are as fit as you and I are, Chad,
yes.
I mean, we just zoom right by those people.
Absolutely.
So there's no chance of, anything,
And that's if they leave the trails open. Some places in California have even shut down running and biking trails.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And the skate parks as well.
Yeah, which I have to say this. They so one city in California, for those who don't know, they took a bunch of sand from the beach and started dumping the sand in the skate park, and the skaters then turned that sand into a dirt bike track. Which, hey, the California government, they tried, and it looks like they failed.
Life finds a way.
Yeah. Let's see. There's a lot to digest today. Let's start off with what the governor laid out on Friday, which was he had a press conference. There were things announced, but not a lot of real changes just yet, right?
Not yet. By this Friday, we're supposed to be able to have retail to go all over Texas, whatever that means. People were trying to figure that out. There are some guidelines posted on the state government's on their websites right now.
Yeah, we've had that up here.
We put that up here as well, and we're figuring out exactly how that's going to look all over the state. But when it comes to retail, Chad, and I don't know the exact numbers on this. I'm going to ask the question of the Retailer Association. How much in sales, percentage-wise, comes from people just walking around the store?
Yeah.
And the whole idea with retail is if you're not going to just buy it on Amazon online or some other website, you go into the brick and mortar store, you wander around, you browse, you pick up things that you didn't think you needed, right? I mean, that's the way it works.
Yeah.
You're checking out at the cash register and you go, oh, there's that thing that I had no idea they even made that thing, and you grab that and put that in your cart as well. So retail to go. That's supposed to start this week. State parks are reopening today with, as you pointed out on social media, with masks, even though you may be miles from somebody else. And
the cactus in Palo Duro may give you the corona. You got to be very careful.
Right. If anybody has ever been to the Big Bend Ranch State Park,
you got to be very careful.
Yeah, I mean, there's nobody around. The last time that I was out there all by myself, I mean, you could have shouted and just heard your own echo, through the canyon forever. But those are open again, starting today. The governor put together this strike force, and it's not a task force, it's a strike force. The real difference, I'm not sure. One difference may be that a lot of mega donors are on the strike force, where a task force may not be that way. You have, I think, on the panel that he put together of business leaders and experts, the folks who are participating have contributed somewhere between $5 and $6 million to Governor Abbott's reelection efforts over the last few years. Buys you a lot of access. We have some very respected business people here, I say, with no irony. Jim Mattress Mac McInvale from Houston, who's very well respected. Tillman Fertitta, who, by the way, Tillman Fertitta laid off something like 40,000 people right out of the gate from his restaurants and casinos. As soon as the restrictions went into place, he said that he did that because he wanted people to be able to get in line, quickly for unemployment benefits. You have Kendra Scott of jewelry fame, who's on this as well. And then you have some of the statewide elected officials, Dan Patrick, you have Glenn Hager, Ken Paxton, and also the Speaker of the House, Dennis Bonnen. I should also say James Huffines, who ran Plains Capital. He's a very well-respected business guy, originally from Dallas, and will be heading this up from the business perspective. There was some criticism from Democrats saying there's not enough health experts or scientists on this deal, which may be valid, but you do have this push and pull happening now with exactly how the state's going to be, quote-unquote, reopen.
Scott, on that list, and I don't know how many are on the strike force, but and it sounds like there's some very good business owners who are on that list. Are there any like small mom and pop? And I know you all have small businesses in Austin. It's not all big tech firms. Do you have like anybody who just owns a store or two stores that's on that list?
I didn't see anybody like that on this list, and there's a lot of concern about the small mom-and-pop businesses being left behind, not just at the state level, but at the federal level as well. You saw where from the Paycheck Protection Program and for the SBA loans that had been given out, you had companies like Ruth's Chris Steakhouse getting $20 million from that. I don't know if the tip was included, Chad. I saw where Shake Shack was giving back $10 million, saying that they felt that the small mom and pops ought to be given access to that cash as well. I was talking with somebody who runs a bank here in Texas, a small community bank. They administered about 52 million in these loans. And when I asked how many businesses does that really help over the course of the next month or 6 weeks, something like that, the answer is about 300.
Yeah.
Folks that different small businesses that they could keep going with their payrolls. So when we hear these numbers like 50 million, 10 million, 20 million, something like that, it might sound like a lot of money to some folks. It sounds like a lot of money to me, but really is a drop in the bucket when you're talking about thousands and thousands of small businesses all across Texas that are suffering.
Yeah. When it comes to the protest this weekend, I don't know if the comment was from you. I saw comments all over social media at these protests that happened down at the Capitol that they had seen more protest on very, very small issues. And I mean, it didn't seem like this was a large protest at the state Capitol over the weekend. Am I wrong?
Not huge. I think they probably topped out at about 200 people at the Texas Capitol grounds this weekend, and similar protests were held in some other places, as you know, in Michigan, I think in Virginia, and a couple of other states, where this didn't seem to be maybe as coordinated as some folks would like to portray it, but it did seem that it did have the backing of some in the business community, and some of the same folks who had originally helped to promote and at least coordinate a little bit of the Tea Party protests, about 10, it doesn't seem like this long ago, but about 10 years ago, about a decade ago already, Freedom Works and groups like that were helping to at least promote these things online. Alex Jones, the provocateur, what would he even call Alex Jones?
Conspiracy theorist.
Conspiracy theorist, InfoWars guy, was foaming.
He has a cool truck. I give him that.
He does have a cool truck. It looks like Mad Max when he's driving around in Austin.
Cool.
And he's sort of an assault. I guess don't take it the wrong way, but assault-style vehicle is the way it was described by somebody. He's
I drive it
out of the top of that thing,
yeah,
screaming about 1776 and all of that. He was at the Capitol grounds, no mask, shaking everybody's hands. If he was going to get COVID-19, he may have gotten it on Saturday. But look, not a huge group, and I think the coverage of these things probably gets a little out of hand, Chad, when when national cable news channels are looking for things to cover, and we see this in a 24-hour news cycle. The protest is an easy thing to cover. Not that they shouldn't, but the coverage should probably be commensurate with the size of the group. And as you said, there are other issues that have come up where there were giant protests at the Texas Capitol that probably didn't get as much coverage as this handful of folks got over the weekend. I did notice that there was a significant group within that smaller group of anti-vaxxer activists, the people who think there should never, ever be vaccines, sort of ironically, those anti-vaxxers confronting a world where there's not a vaccine for the thing that's causing all the problems.
When it comes to the governor's recommendations or the governor's executive orders, whatever it may be, did he lay out any type of timeline to actually reopen, or is this a strike force that'll get together at some point to begin making those recommendations?
It's more of the latter. I think over the next 10 days, they're going to be taking a look at exactly what recommendations they want to put in place to try to, quote-unquote, reopen the Texas economy. People are suffering all over the place, Chad. As we mentioned, there are people who are standing in lines at food banks from Houston to San Antonio to Austin and everywhere in between. People who are out of work suddenly because of what has happened, not only with COVID-19, but also in the oil and gas industry and the oil field services companies, particularly in Houston. I saw a line it was on television. There's the line of cars for miles in the Cypress area in Harris County, and just heartbreaking stories all over the place. And so there is real pressure to try to do two things at once. Let's cut to the chase here, Chad. If they're going to reopen the Texas economy and the economy of the United States, what we really need is more robust testing for this virus and for antibodies so that we have the information we need to develop a public health and economic strategy that go together. I think the way this has been covered is a left versus right sort of thing, or a business versus public health sort of thing, which is just not the way that this has to be discussed. Instead of an adversarial situation, it can be a collaborative situation if we have the data, if we know where the disease actually is, which populations are actually carrying the disease, which have maybe already had, experienced coronavirus and basically self-corrected, because there's some people who probably had the disease and didn't even know it, Chad.
Right.
They might have never had symptoms, and they self-resolved, I think is the way the public health people talk about it. If you have that information, you can start to put together a strategy that basically lays out which people can go back to work, which people can start to re-engage in commerce, while protecting those who are at risk, those who are vulnerable, because it still seems that there are, even though there are people who are young who are getting coronavirus, it still seems to be the elderly and those who have an underlying other condition who are at most at risk of this being a fatal situation. So put those people back to work when you have the data and continue to protect the people who are the most vulnerable. There can be a strategy that they put together that accomplishes both things without it having to be an either-or, where you're either restarting the economy or you are hurting those vulnerable people.
Before I let you go, I had the speaker on last week and asked him, obviously he won't be speaker in the next session, but right. If there's any plan, if there's any scenario under which you would have a session where people are social distancing, what that would look like. Scott, you're reporting that they're starting to talk about that, or at least some lawmakers are starting to talk about what that would look like, correct?
Absolutely. They're trying to figure out how they would hold debates in the Texas House, the Texas Senate, if staffers had to work from home, if lawmakers maybe only had to be on the floor one or two at a time. A lot of times in the Texas House, you've seen the videos and have been there, for the legislative session where you'll see a debate play out where there's one member of the House on the front microphone and one on the back microphone. It might be that they would only allow those two people to be on the floor at a time, debating these sorts of things. They've started to try to game this out, and there's nothing concrete in place. But it's just another thing to kind of remind folks that for all of the talk of reopening Texas, reopening the economy, they're starting to have genuine talks in Austin about how they would run the Texas legislature if social distancing was still in place and most Texans were not even allowed in their state capital. So ongoing discussions happening, and we've got the details about that at quorumreport.com.
Before I let you go, is there, and I've talked about this with the U.S. Congress, that there should be under some type of emergency where lawmakers can vote from remote locations, to keep the actual government running. Does Texas have anything like that where they can vote remotely?
We don't have anything like that right now. I think that would be addressed through the House and Senate rules, although I'd need to go back and research whether the Constitution requires them to actually be in the building. There's one thing we can say for sure, Chad. There has been some rumor about the legislature maybe meeting, but meeting at a later date, later than January. But the Texas Constitution says that they can't do that. The Texas Constitution says they meet, at high noon on that second Tuesday in January, and they can't suspend the Constitution. So if they were going to do that, vote remotely, they'd have to figure it out before then, have some kind of a plan in place that maybe they could come to the Capitol and vote on those new rules to be able to vote, remotely from their home districts. Right now, I think last week in Utah, they were doing their very first ever virtual legislative session, a special session where the members of their legislature in Utah were voting from their home district. So if it sounds far-fetched, it's actually happening in a different state right now.
If Austin's a hot spot, could they have a virtual Capitol in a different city or hold session in a different city?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're going to have to do some research on that, but it does seem that everything would have to be on the table. I was told by sources that they would consider any and all options for trying to carry out the functions of state government.
Yeah, all right. Scott, tell folks what they can find at Quorum Report.
We've got all that for you, and we're also going to have a profile of the man who has been tapped to coordinate the strike force, Mike Toomey, longtime lobbyist, one of the most powerful and influential men in Texas, getting to work on trying to figure out how to reopen this economy. We've got it all for you at quorumreport.com.
All right, Scott, as always, appreciate your time. We'll visit with you next week.
Thanks, Chad. Stay safe.
That's Scott Braddock, editor, quorumreport.com.